Yeah, this album is a bit complicated to talk about the entire process because while it took 2 years in the making, when I say 2 years, I mean the entire, I pretty much did almost everything on this record. From the writing to the recording to some of the sound engineering to the mixing, the exception being the mastering aspect of the record. So while much of the material is newer material written over the last 2 years, the themes, ideas, insights, and realizations behind it span a very long stretch of time. So it's over 15 years. So some people who are familiar with some of the other work that I've been doing will know that this is a very unusual creative expression for me because they're not used to seeing this angle of the personality. But the first composition that's part of this narrative that you mentioned is actually stretching back to 15 years. It's basically untouched. It's basically with little minor edits here and there. So I guess that's the best place to start in telling the story. So we're talking 15 years ago. I was in a stage of isolation, was not interacting too much with the society. I was basically living as a hermit. And some people who are familiar with my story know that I was a hermit for a certain stretch of time, deeply involved in spiritual process and meditation and yoga. Basically, my whole life was, from morning to evening, was dedicated to unfolding this self-knowledge. And it was at that time a very dark phase of life. I didn't know which direction I was heading. I had been suffering already from depression, fear of death, for many, many years before that. So in this dark phase and in this isolation, there was one composition I wrote called the Dark Bardo, which was kind of me in this isolated atmosphere, just falling into a stream of consciousness and purging out pure expressions of this darkness and just seeing what came out. And what came out was a mirror reflection of the state of mind which I was in at the time, which was one of anguish, anxiety, as I said, uncertainty about the future, and just not having any sense of meaning to one's life. And all of that was, with this first composition, was kind of like just empty canvas, bucket of paint, and just spilling it with raw authenticity. So the record starts off with this very chaotic, disturbed, troubling tone. And it took me a while to even understand. Now, in hindsight, looking back, I have a better sense of the process that was unfolding within me. But that was the first composition written 15 years ago. And then, 15 years later, I just started reconnecting a little bit more with my musical instincts. So I just picked up the guitar one day and I fell into a sentiment of just really feeling connected to the moment. And music was flowing. So I had this one line, this one part which stretched for about 15 minutes. And it was totally improvised. And I started constructing a whole composition around it. And once the composition was complete, it was just like a light turned on and I instantly understood, oh, this is the continuation of that piece that I wrote 15 years ago. Except now it's the other side of the coin. While the first piece, which is called the Dark Bardo, was very dark, disturbed, and troubling, this was illuminating, blissful, serenity, peace of mind. And it was a little bit shocking to realize how a piece that I had written 15 years ago was literally a continuation of that piece, because it was kind of like, I suppose the message it was that after having passed through all of this trial and tribulation and struggle, now finally here is the resolution. and it got captured in that 15-minute improvisation. So, which is now, unfortunately, it's not on the record because it's a very, very long piece, and I couldn't squeeze it in the record because it would just be too much of a long record.
So how many songs are on the record?
There are 10 songs. And that piece that I mentioned is called the Light Bardo, so it's the resolution of that. And once I instantly understood that somehow this is an unfolding and a continuation of that process that started 15 years ago, the moment that became conscious, it kind of like set this chain reaction where now all these doors were opening. I could finally express, you know, all the different phases that I had been through in those 15 years. Except I wasn't thinking too much about this at the time. It was kind of just following whatever intuitive spirit was flowing through me. And then the idea for the name of the record, Hanging in the Balance, what's so expressive about that is because it took me a while to really understand what this record was trying to express, because the creative process was just so spontaneous. And now I understand it a bit better, and it's really changed the way that I just understand art, and not just music, visual arts, poetry, all the arts, architecture and so on. I really see this as opening channels of communication between the conscious and the unconscious. That's when you're in the zone. That's when the creative process is just flowing, and you're not in a position of authority. You're just in the back seat as if you're just taking dictation. Kind of reminds me of how in some tantric teachings they talk about this process where in a dream you'll receive one small fragment of the teaching, and then the next day another fragment, and then another, and you're not quite sure how the whole process is unfolding, but there's a definite direction, and you're just flowing with as little resistance to that process. So basically, it was only after that 10th composition was complete, then the full cycle was clear. This is one full cycle. And the cycle, basically, if I was going to try to simplify it, think of struggle on one extreme, surrender on the other polar extreme, and all these shades in between. That's kind of how this record unfolded. It was like a storyline that was developing. So is it a concept record? I would say it's definitely a concept record, but not a concept record in the sense of one novel. It's more like, I like to think of it more like several short stories which share many intertwining, interweaving themes, and some of those themes deal with very deep personal stuff. There's a lot of light in it, and there's a lot of dark in it. So, fear of death, struggling with mortality of the body, coping with desire, what role should desire play in the inner life? There's a dualism to that too. You know, it can be, while we cannot live without desire, and the fulfillment of desire adds a certain sense of appreciation to life.
And I guess that's where the title comes from, Hanging in the Balance.
Exactly. I noticed among these interweaving themes, one thing remained constant, and that's what really unifies the whole record, is this idea of tension between opposites. Tension between the conscious and the unconscious, between struggle and the resolution of that struggle. So basically 10 songs, part of one complete cycle, unified by this theme of tension between opposites. And I really wanted to, of course, when you're writing a record, you don't know which song is going to be the first on the record, the second, the third, and fourth. It's only in hindsight, when you look back and you have the whole collection, then you're thinking more in terms of how can you create a sonic landscape or a sonic experience where you're taking the viewer, the listener, on a journey where maybe they can have some glimpse of both that struggle and the beauty of resolving that struggle. So for me, being receptive to receive these compositions and then finally making it tangible, it wasn't just creation of art or music from my perspective. Each composition was like an entire initiation in its own. And once the composition was complete, it's as if, okay, finally, all this internalization that I've been carrying within me, spanning 15 years, was finally expressed. And in a way, the psychological relief of giving it tangible expression in this way, it changes you. It changes you.